Welcome to Shootin Straight. I'm your host, Ken Buck. In today's highly partisan environment, political adversaries often minimize each other's arguments by labeling motives rather than engaging in constructive dialogue. For the next 30 minutes or so, I invite you to join me as we cut through the political noise and learn about what inspires our guest and about his enthusiasm for faster internet and better government policies that have a positive, real-world effect for everyday Americans. Today, we will explore his work as the former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. It is my pleasure to welcome Ajit Pai to the show. Are you ready to start shooting straight?
I am, Congressman. Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor.
It's my pleasure. You, as the chairman of the FCC, you did a great job in really bringing the free market to the internet and bridging the digital divide and making sure that more people had access to the internet. What is it about your heart, your background, your love of country that led you to do those things?
Well, it's a good question. Yeah, thank you for the kind words, for your support over the years. For me, having grown up in rural Kansas on a dirt road outside of Parsons, I was keenly aware every time I went back home that not everybody had the same access to technology as people in big cities like Washington, D.C. And especially nowadays when things like telework and telehealth and remote learning and precision agriculture all rely on that internet platform, it seemed to me important to extend what I call digital opportunity to every single American, especially Americans in rural areas. So on my first full day in office, January 24th, 2017, I told the FCC's assembled staff, we have a lot of things on our plate, but to me, there's nothing more important than closing that digital divide, making sure every American has a chance to succeed. And I'm proud to say that we did a lot of work along those lines over the 4 years that followed and made some inroads in closing that divide.
Good. I want to talk a little bit about your background because I think it's a really fascinating upbringing that you had. Your parents are born in India.
Yeah.
They're trained and educated as doctors. They come to the United States. They settle in Buffalo, New York.
Right.
And then you're born 1973.
Exactly.
And your family moves to Kansas at that point, and in a fairly rural part of Kansas.
Yeah.
What was it like growing up in Kansas?
It was wonderful. It was really, I know when people think Kansas, they think flat land and not a lot of trees, not many people. It must be exceptionally boring and non-diverse there. But for me, it was a fantastic place to grow up. And I think partly because of my personality, I was sort of a shy, more awkward kid, a little insecure, but having a nurturing environment like that where everybody knew everybody else, everyone treated you with respect, it was just a fantastic place to be. And it was also the kind of place in those days where you'd leave your front door unlocked. My mom would often leave her keys in the car. An incredibly safe environment as well. But even more than that now, when I go back, I can see it reflected in the faces that I interact with, that people really care about the community, about the people who live in that community. And whenever I go back, someone will recognize me at the local store and we'll just strike up a conversation as if I'd never left. And I know people overuse that term community these days, but it really felt like that. Felt like a large, enhanced family in many ways.
And you do go back every so often.
I do. I love going back. And every time I go, I always make a point of visiting either my high school and or my elementary school and visiting the teachers there, visiting with students. And it's just a wonderful way to reconnect and let the kids know as well, because I think you might see this in your district too, but a lot of these rural communities, people just assume that their horizons are capped because of who they are, where they happen to live. And my message to those kids is always never accept that limitation. If a kid like me, a shy, awkward, gangly Indian kid in Kansas in the 70s and 80s can accede to the biggest jobs at the FCC, there's no limit to what you can accomplish too. And so hopefully through my example and my words, I can inspire them to be even bigger and better than anything I accomplished.
So did you ever find Dorothy or Toto?
I know. I never did. It's funny, when I was growing up, I would read Wizard of Oz. And for me and my classmates, it was, we were aware of it, but it wasn't that big of a deal. But I remember going to college and, of course, after that, everyone on the East Coast, when they hear you're from Kansas, that's the first question. So, I would love to go back and see if kids are still reading that book.
Where is that yellow brick road? You're still looking for it?
No kidding, right?
Okay.
The Emerald City. Still haven't found it yet, but I'll keep you posted.
Good.
Toto's got to be moseying around here somewhere.
I'm sure you've heard of some tornadoes in the area, but maybe not the rest of it. But
yeah, exactly.
So you graduate from high school in Kansas and
Yeah.
you go to Harvard. intimidated?
Very intimidated. I had gone to summer school there in 1989, so I had a sense of the layout of the place. But to go there full time as a student in the fall of 1990, coming from a smaller town high school, public high school like Parsons, it was intimidating. You're seeing kids who went to these fancy schools that everybody knows by one name: Andover, Exeter, Choate, things like that. Here I am, coming from where I came from. But what I quickly realized over the first year, I'd say the end of the first year, beginning of the second year, is that I could work just as hard as anybody else. I could have the aptitude that anybody else had. There's no reason why, coming from my background, I had to accept that I wasn't going to be able to compete. And once I made that realization, then I was sort of off to the races. I loved it. I absolutely was thrilled with the academic experience. So taking classes from experts in economics or experts in ancient Chinese art and history and literature and things like that. And in an academic sense, it was just an enormously rewarding experience for me.
So on the social side, on the political side, what was the impact of Kansas? Where were you on the political spectrum before you went to Harvard, and where were you after you graduated from Harvard?
It's very interesting. Going into college, I was very much on the left. I was pretty much a solid Democrat up and down the line on virtually every issue, or so I thought. And what I found interestingly over the course of my 4 years at Harvard was that I was starting to question some of those foundational assumptions about why I thought what I thought. Taking a lot of economics courses, for example, forced me to reckon with how does policy affect the basic human incentives for people to organize their lives. Taking a lot of history made me think, well, given the history of the 20th century, why do certain ideological movements that I thought I was sympathetic to not deserve that? Why do they not deserve that sympathy? And just over time, also just the way people behaved about certain political issues, you're banging the drum very loudly, even though these tended to be people from very privileged backgrounds. It just made me wonder, where was I really on the political spectrum? And if you told the freshman me that the senior me would be where he ended up, the freshman me probably would have been a little horrified. But to me, it was a very thoughtful and accidental journey in many ways.
Well, what was it like dealing with some of these kids that grew up with wealth on the East Coast, went to prep school, you from a minority family in Kansas and going to public high school, and you talked to them about some issues? Was it an open dialogue? Were they open to the discussion? Were they aggravated that they were being questioned? Where were they? What were they like?
According to my own memory bank, at least, they were very open to discussions. I remember we would have these extensive couple hours long lunches sometimes where we just discuss a bunch of different issues. And I remember very vividly when the Gulf War was being prosecuted, having debates about the legality and morality of that and whether former President George H.W. Bush did the right thing. And so I think people are very open to pretty much any issue. And the particular dorm where I was at Harvard also had something called the Wall, where people could inscribe different thoughts and then people could respond to those thoughts. And so I was a very active participant in the Wall. I actually loved that true marketplace of ideas. And in my experience, at least, a lot of the kids, even the ones from privileged backgrounds, were open to that. They might not agree with you, of course, at the end of the day, but at least at lunches and on the Wall and things like that, they were open.
Interesting. And so you graduate from Harvard and you go to the University of Chicago Law School. Again, you're getting back to the Midwest, but still a big city compared to Parsons, Kansas.
Yeah.
What was that like at the University of Chicago?
It was wonderful. I mean, I can't say I enjoyed the weather all that much. I can't say that it was easy, to say the least, but it was one of the formative intellectual experiences of my life, looking back on it, to be with some of these great minds in the legal academy, Richard Epstein and Richard Posner and David Curry and all these different scholars, and to have the chance to interact with my classmates who many of them remain friends to this day. It was just a terrific experience, and it helped me think more critically. As you know, being a lawyer, it's the process of learning law forces you to be a better thinker, better writer, better speaker. And each of those things have served me very well over the subsequent part of my career.
So with Harvard and the University of Chicago, somewhere you developed this love of the free market and this idea that the right solution is the solution that empowers individuals, not empowers government. Where did that come from in that mix?
I think it was a sort of a combination of different factors. Through my economics training, I learned that ultimately competition and the free market are better guarantors of consumer welfare than government intervention. When the government intervenes, it necessarily drives investment decisions a certain way. It advantages some and not others. It picks winners and losers. And history teaches us that that's not a recipe for success. Same thing through my study of history as well. If you look at some of the more interventionist governments over time, ultimately, it may sound appealing to the populace in the near term, but in the long run, they deliver very poor results for their citizens. And also just, I think in terms of commitment to, or I guess consistency with other values I hold dear, free expression, free speech, things like that, it seems to me the free market is a much better way to sustain those values as opposed to putting the government in charge, because inevitably a government that's in charge of the economy will look to control other aspects of society. And that's a very dangerous road for our country to go down.
So I want to talk about faith for a second, because you really had three sort of different influences in education, and some of that may have influenced faith, and there may be some other influences on faith. But tell me a little bit about your faith.
Yeah, so I was raised a Hindu by my father and mother, and learned all about the faith through them and through my grandparents in particular, who lived in Bangalore. And but then I also learned about other faiths growing up in Kansas. And one of the things I learned was I played violin as a classically trained violinist starting about the age of 5 or 6. And for me to get extra practice, my violin teacher asked me, she was a Lutheran, so she asked me, hey, would you mind playing with a couple of other kids at our Lutheran church? It helps support some of the musical songs in the services. And so I agreed to do that. And it was great because I'd play and then we'd listen to these sermons. And what was striking to me, even as a kid, is how consistent the messages from the pastor were with the things I was learning from my own Hindu teaching. And so to me, at least, it kind of spoke to, and I know this sounds cheesy, but sort of the oneness of faith and how important it is in giving you this backbone, so to speak, to your character. It really was an eye-opening experience for me, even at a young age.
One of the things I find amazing is how many similarities there are between different faiths around the world, and how even in language we talk about loving your neighbor, and it's really something that I think if more people appreciated, we would have this greater understanding and sympathy for folks of different faith. But you saw that firsthand in a town like Parsons. Definitely.
And even now, I still make those connections like you do. My wife is Byzantine Catholic, and whenever we go back to Ohio for Easter, which is coming up, of course, I would love sitting in the pews and just listening to the services and the message that was being conveyed. And it's a great way to ensure that those values are going to be continued across countries, across communities for generations. And that ultimately is what society is about. It's not about the material things that we might acquire or seek to acquire. It's about those values that sustain us. And again, I know it sounds kind of cheesy to some, but that's really what it's all about at the end of the day for me.
Yeah, it doesn't sound cheesy to me.
Okay. That's great.
I appreciate it.
We live in a cynical age, as you know. So
yeah. So Ajit Pai grows up in Kansas, goes to Harvard, University of Chicago Law School. At some point, you end up at the FCC, and then you are promoted by President Trump. I think it's a promotion to chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. And there's this thing going on, this debate in America about net neutrality. Right. Tell us, what is net neutrality?
So net neutrality basically involves the question of how do you want the government to regulate the internet? Do you want it to be more interventionist and dictate how private businesses deploy their capital, how they operate those networks, and that sort of thing? Or do you want to take a more free market approach? My vision was always the free market one. And this is actually a bipartisan decision. Starting in the Clinton administration, when the internet was first commercialized, there was a very distinct determination by the FCC chairman at the time, we're not going to subject this new technology to the heavy-handed rules that were developed for Ma Bell, AT&T, back in the 1930s. And as a result of that, from 1995 until 2015, we saw $1.5 trillion of network investment, companies like Facebook and Google and Netflix becoming global giants. And we saw consumers benefiting from all these online applications. So to me, the internet is one of the greatest free market success stories in history. And that's part of the reason why I was resistant to the notion that the government should be the one driving these decisions, which is a decision the Obama FCC made in 2015.
So I I don't want to go too deep.
Oh, yeah.
Because I know you could talk for hours about the details of the regulations, but what are some of the regulations that held back folks from using the internet, or people investing in the internet, or the internet becoming more widely used?
It's a great question. And so I think it's best told from the perspective of some of these small businesses. I talked to, for example, an owner of a company called Aristotle. She runs a fixed wireless company near Little Rock, Arkansas. And what she told me is that when these regulations were passed in 2015, and she had to go to the bank and raise more funds in order to build out the internet to other people outside of Little Rock, people who didn't have internet at all. One of the questions the bank gave her was, well, we see all these new heavy-handed regulations coming from Washington that are going to require you to do all this paperwork, that are going to micromanage your business, that might essentially prohibit you from offering certain kinds of services. Why should we invest as much in you now, given that there's this regulatory onslaught coming? And to me, at least, people like her, Elizabeth Bowles was her name, she is sort of the canary in the coal mine. Those small businesses that won't be able to raise capital and build these internet infrastructures, those are the people who are going to suffer the most. And ultimately, that's what's proven. Now, for the first time outside of a recession, we saw investment in internet infrastructure decline in the past in 2015 to 2017. And that's not the way it should be, to me.
So it's really a matter of the more investment, the more infrastructure, the more access.
Definitely.
And the regulatory burden really hampered the investment side of the equation.
Absolutely. And also putting the government in charge of what services can be offered. One of the things that the Obama FCC was exploring was banning telecom companies from offering services for free because they worried that would be too much of an anti-competitive threat. California has done that as well with its own legislation. And just this week, AT&T announced that it was going to stop offering certain telehealth services to veterans for free because that violates California's net neutrality law. And that's a good example of the unintended consequences here. It might sound good in theory, but in practice, unfortunately, it ultimately disturbs consumers.
So overall numbers, how many people didn't have access to the internet when you started as chairman, and what has the trend been?
The trend has been strongly positive in terms of the number of Americans who have access now that didn't have it before. When I came into office, approximately 34 million Americans didn't have it at the FCC's definition of broadband. And when I left, about 10 or 11 million, depending on how you count it, didn't have broadband. And we're still making inroads. One of the initiatives I started last year will come to fruition this year and next to get rural broadband out there, and that'll cover millions more. So progress is being made, and I know it's slow for some, but it is progress nonetheless.
Great. And you've traveled the country as FCC chairman and talked to people. What kind of stories have you heard from individuals? It's great to know the numbers, but now you get to look somebody in the eye and hear a story. What kind of stories did you hear?
And I've got to tell you, Congressman, this was the best part of the job. Unlike any other chairman before me, I made a point of getting out to the country. I'm pretty sure I visited more states than any other chairman, 49 states in the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And, when I was in Mandan, North Dakota, I had a chance to meet Cullen Quill, who that very day, thanks to an FCC policy, was being connected with gigabit fiber. And I asked him what a difference that would make in his life. And he thought about it for a second and said, well, now my wife and I don't have to pile the kids in the truck and drive west to Bismarck so we can piggyback off the McDonald's Wi-Fi system so they can download and upload their homework. I remember visiting the Jemez Pueblo, a very poor Indian reservation in rural New Mexico, where an 8th grader told me, almost with tears in her eyes, that now because of a fiber connection due again to an FCC policy, she was able to do her homework reliably without having to wonder, how are we going to be able to study? And just things like that. Stories across the country, farmers who got 4G LTE for the first time and now could engage in precision agriculture and put better, cheaper food on the table.
What is precision agriculture?
Oh, sorry. So to me, at least, this is one of the best examples of how broadband can transform a community. So precision agriculture is essentially the use of broadband, use of the internet, to improve how farmers and ranchers do what they do. So, for example, if you've got a corn farm, you can now use a GPS-controlled combine to direct it very precisely. You can also use 4G LTE and other wireless applications to survey by the square yard what the soil moisture is. Does it need fertilizer? How much did we give it last year? And should we give it fertilizer again this year? Just a much more precise way of farming that's incredible in terms of yield and everything about it's just tremendous. So.
I hear your rural roots coming out now.
Oh, it's great.
You just gave 3 examples of folks that are in rural areas, reservations and on a farm, and how they benefited from your work. I assume that folks in the urban areas also benefit.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things we made a priority for too, is just to encourage more competition, more fiber deployment in some of these urban areas. And we saw results there too. And I remember the New Orleans Public Housing Authority, I did a new visit there and I met some people who had fiber for the first time. Even though New Orleans is a big city, of course, this part had essentially been left out of that digital revolution. And they were now able to apply for jobs, educate their kids reliably, give the kids something to do if it was raining outside, just those basic things that some people take for granted. And what I often told my staff is, you know what, this is the reason we do the job. You're never going to see these folks on the front pages of the New York Times. CNN's not going to do a showcase about them, but look in their faces when they tell you their story, and you'll know why our positions are so important and why we've got to give it our all with the time that we've been given.
So Ajit Pai is trained as an economist, goes to law school, influenced by University of Chicago professors, a free market champion. You go to the FCC, you become the chairman of the FCC. You are working on repealing net neutrality and providing access to more people, poor people primarily.
Yeah.
Wealthy people had access to the internet. So you're really, these numbers from 34 million to 11 million are the folks that really didn't have the money to afford some of the luxuries. How did the left react to you helping the poor?
Well, they weren't big fans of mine, to say the least. I knew this is more of almost a religious issue with them as opposed to a reasoned decision-making process. Anything having to do with net neutrality, they immediately thought, okay, any changes are bad. And in particular, because I was very outspoken about why I thought we needed to return to that light touch free market framework, they saw me as a target. And so they would respond not with arguments in kind, here's my economic reasoning, or here's why I think you're wrong, Ajit. It was more just invective. And I hate to say it, but they were fed by politicians, by celebrities, by others who had a platform and could have used that platform for more reasoned discourse, but instead chose the lowest common denominator. And it's unfortunately all too typical of our civil society these days.
I want to be careful, but I want to use some of the terms that I've read about and just get your reaction, because I think it's really important that people understand. I certainly have been attacked in some of the same ways, but here are people on the left who claim that conservatives are racist and bigoted and homophobic and all the different labels that they can put on conservatives. But because of your love of the free market and really huge beneficial impact as a result of your policies. I read something that you were called a dirty, sneaky Indian.
Yeah.
That people came up and looked in the windows of your home, and that you were concerned. Your children were 3 and 5 at the time, and they were concerned.
Yeah.
You were concerned about their safety. Things that nobody should be subjected to. Things that are criminal in nature. How did that affect you and your family?
It was really hard. I signed up for the job. My wife didn't. My kids didn't. My parents didn't. My in-laws didn't. Yet they were affected directly. And that's one of the things I tell people. Look, words have consequences. And when you have people with a platform stirring up hatred in the countryside, that has a real effect. And, some of it was directly threatening. I'll never forget being at work, getting a series of emails. One had a picture of me sitting in a chair with a picture of my family in the background. The next one I remember had a list of preschools that were near my house that this individual thought my son went to. And then the third one said something to the effect of, I've got a gun and I'm coming to kill your kids. I mean, what do you do with that? You've got to take it seriously. And I had to tell my wife. That was a hard conversation. I had to get law enforcement involved. That individual ultimately went to jail, but not before we went through all this, having security at the house, having to spend thousands on a security camera system, often wondering when I went to events, look at this guy out there, I'm still traveling during this time. And that's why I often think, it was hard enough for me, but God bless people like you who are actually representing constituents out in your districts, out in your states, seeing people who are dedicated patriots because you love your country and you're willing to do it despite the invective you get. I mean, I'm just essentially a faceless bureaucrat in DC in many ways, or I was, but those of you who serve deserve our eternal gratitude. I know what it's like to go through the fire, and it's not easy. And that's one of the things, that's probably the only regret I have of the job, is that there were times when, my wife or my in-laws, especially, their number, unlike my parents, was listed. So they would get these calls at 3 a.m, cursing them out or yelling at them and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I wish none of that had been visited upon them. They didn't sign up for it.
Yeah. My staff doesn't let me look at my Facebook account or my Twitter account or other things. I obviously approve Facebook posts most of the time and tweets, but you ever look at your account?
I do.
What was your favorite? I shouldn't say
my favorite was
least favorite.
Yeah, no, I think my favorite was I can't remember the name of the account, but it was somebody with hundreds of thousands, maybe even 1 million followers, who posted something that said, this is almost verbatim, had a picture of me in my official picture from the FCC, and it said something like, he is literally worse than Hitler ever was, or something like that. And, look, I understand that internet policy is something that drives a lot of passion. Compared to one of the greatest villains in history who murdered millions of Jews and others, I mean, come on, this is just utterly, it's so above the pale that I would think even the reasonable people on the left would say, okay, that's a bit much. But unfortunately, it's par for the course now. I mean, I see a lot of that invective on social media. But the interesting thing is, I could have just scrolled up in the ball and said, okay, I'm not going to engage with it. But what I tried to do was to counterbalance it when I was on the road. So I do these town halls at colleges and universities and high schools, hostile territory. These are not my prime constituents, to say the least. But I was struck because every single time, literally every time, a student would come up to me afterward and would say, you know what, I came in just hating your guts. Now actually seeing you and hearing you, I'd never heard these arguments, or you seem actually quite thoughtful to me. And I don't know why people are so angry about this. And it's just a great feeling to know that, at least, taking the spoon and taking a little water out of the ocean through each of these town halls, I could change some minds. And to me, that was a powerful reaffirmation of the fact that at the end of the day, whatever's on social media, it's not the real world. I mean, the real world is people like you and me sitting here having a conversation face to face and trying to find common ground. That's part of what kept me going during the dark times.
Yeah. So you grew up in rural Kansas. Your parents are medical professionals.
Yeah.
You provide or help provide internet access to more people. What was the impact on rural medicine?
Tremendous. I mean, much to my parents' chagrin, I didn't go to medical school, and I think they still hold out hope that one of these days, when I figure out what I do next, it'll involve medicine in some way. But to me, at least, it's been tremendously rewarding to be able to contribute to the growth of telemedicine and telehealth, especially for these rural areas. I'm sure you've seen it in Colorado. I've seen it in Kansas, that there are many Americans who don't have access to quality healthcare in the communities where they live. My own father's a good example of that. He's a urologist. And I remember when I was a kid, sometimes he would get up in the morning before dawn, drive 45 minutes west, next day drive 45 minutes north to provide care to communities where there wasn't a urologist anywhere near there. Well, telehealth can help change that. And so at the FCC, we've got a rural healthcare program that we increased the budget for when I was in office for the first time in 24 years. To make sure that we address that rural gap. We also, through the CARES Act, got funding to start a telehealth program that we used to target parts of the country that were hard hit with COVID. And more generally, I established some partnerships with the VA, with the HHS, and state health authorities as well to make sure that telehealth becomes much more of the norm. It's a more connected society, and I think that has tremendous potential for folks in rural areas so that they don't have to drive 3 hours just to get seen. That's not the America I want. I want people to get quality healthcare wherever they happen to be. And broadband's a powerful way to do that.
So during COVID, a lot of the schools shut down in student or in class education, and went to all virtual and then some hybrid. What was the effect of the internet expansion? Why was that a big deal?
I've often said that the most important decisions the FCC ever made with respect to COVID were made before anyone even heard of COVID. All of those free market decisions that you and I have been talking about, and others that we haven't had a chance to cover, arcane things like reducing the cost and time to get pole attachments or making it easier to deploy conduit under the ground. All of those things combined to give us world-class internet infrastructure so that when COVID forced hundreds of millions of Americans to live at home, work from home, study at home, we had the internet that was able to sustain that increase in traffic. And granted, there's still millions of Americans who don't have it, but for those who did, it was a lifesaver. It really helped keep society going. And that's part of the reason why I often say that broadband was the unsung hero of the past year. If this had happened 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I really wonder how society would have functioned. But because we had broadband, things were better than they otherwise would have been. Much better.
So as lawyers, we studied the Bill of Rights. First Amendment's a huge deal.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things that sets America apart from most of the rest of the world, our love for free speech and the interaction of ideas. Again, you increase access to the internet. How does that affect the First Amendment?
To me, at least, the internet should be one of the most democratizing things that a society has ever seen. In the old days, of course, if you didn't have a pulpit, you couldn't preach. Well, now anybody should be able to enter that digital public square and express his or her views. And to me, at least, it goes hand in hand with the First Amendment, the ideal of the First Amendment, at least, which is that America uniquely is a place where every American has just as much a right as any other American to say his or her piece. That's how I envision it, at least. And that's part of the reason why I wanted internet to be ubiquitous. Nowadays, of course, that's under challenge, of course, by some of the online providers, social media companies and others, as well as a fraying of just the mere belief in free speech as a value. I think that old saying that was misascribed to Voltaire, I may disagree with what you say, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. There's a pretty big chunk of Americans who don't believe that anymore. And so I've often said it's incumbent upon every American generation to reaffirm that commitment. The First Amendment is nice, but ultimately it's just cold parchment if we don't have an ongoing cultural commitment to sustain it.
Yeah. The idea of the American economy, in my mind anyway, is really built on innovation.
Yeah.
We are a society of free thinkers, and we express ourselves in creative ways. And there are countries that have lower labor costs. There are countries that have lower energy costs in production. There are countries that have advantages in a lot of different areas. We out-innovate everybody. How does the internet affect that innovation, that thriving economy?
It's tremendous because it ensures that any American who has a good idea and has an internet connection is instantly able to reach a national, even global audience. And I've seen that in unexpected places. You know, one of the visits I did in South Dakota with Senator Thune, we visited a woman who had an interest in fashion. She grew up in Vermillion, South Dakota, and thought, to do what I want to do, I've got to move to Chicago or Los Angeles. But she ended up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, of all places. And she had the foresight to create an internet site early on. And now she exports around all 50 states around the world, and she's making a name for herself in a community she loves. And I think there's a lot of human capital that in previous generations would have sat on the shelf because there wasn't a way to express it. Now, because of the internet, all of this entrepreneurial spirit can express itself wherever it happens to be. And we're seeing that increasingly now. I just gave a speech recently where I called this concept digital federalism. You know, coming out of COVID, I think a lot of employers have recognized, wow, our employees don't have to be in the Bay Area or in Boston or New York. They can be anywhere. And so you're seeing companies choose to site in cities and states that are just friendly to innovation, that have a good lifestyle, that have low taxes, that offer the things that people would want to build their families around. And it's an exciting time for America. It's going to be disruptive, but I think the communities that see it as a forward-thinking opportunity are going to be very well served. And I can't wait to see it transpire. Hopefully Kansas is a part of that too.
Well, thank you for doing that, because I really believe in it, and I've co-authored a book, and I write about you in that book as a hero, because I just believe the impact that you've had on the internet and really on access to the internet is so important in so many different ways. I have to ask you my favorite question of the episode here. The question is, if loving this is wrong, I don't want to be right. What is this?
Well, so at the risk of severely embarrassing myself in the eyes of you and millions of other Americans, I would have to say Judge Judy. I love Judge Judy. My mom and I have watched her for almost 30 years now. The way she dispenses tough love from the bench is just so engrossing. And a few years ago, I had a chance to go to Los Angeles for some meetings, and I pulled some strings and managed to get a visit with Judge Judy. And I told my mom about this on a Friday. Hey, I'm going to be heading down to LA on Sunday, have a meeting with Judge Judy on Monday. She canceled all of her patients for Monday, flew to LA with me, and was in the courtroom with the judge on that Monday. And afterward, she never told me directly, but I heard from some of her friends, Ajit, she's so proud of you. Not because I got tapped by the 2 presidents for this job, but you got her in to see Judge Judy. And so to me, it was sort of reified in my parents' eyes. Like, my kid is somebody. Absolutely. But there's something about Judge Judy I think resonates across generations and politics. I think there's actually more there than meets the eye, because I think she represents that sense of rule of law and fairness and being good to one another and just being a responsible citizen that people want. And so anyway, if loving Judge Judy is right, or is wrong, I don't want to be right.
So did your mom ever give any testimony in the courtroom when she was there with Judge Judy about your childhood? Anything you did wrong?
Thank goodness she didn't, but we actually got to meet with the judge behind the scenes in her chambers, as it were. And it was kind of embarrassing, watching my mom say, "Oh, he's been such a big fan of yours since he was 19. And like, Mom, this is the judge. I've got this august position. I'm wearing this fancy suit. She doesn't want to hear about all that. But she was enormously, very, very hospitable, and all that she's accomplished in her career too. It's amazing. She's an American success story in her own right. But anyway, it was a great experience, and one that I'll cherish forever.
It's fun seeing your enthusiasm with your parents and your love for your parents and family. It's really neat.
To me, I often tear up when I think about them, because they came to the United States with literally nothing in 1971 other than $8, a transistor radio, and a belief in the American dream. And I sometimes wonder if you could go back in time and tell those 2 individuals who had no safety net, nothing. We didn't come from family on either side of the family. There didn't come from money on either side of the family. If you told them, your son, 1 generation later, is going to be tapped by the President of the United States to lead this important agency, what would they have said? They might not have believed it, but I think they would have wanted to believe it, because they believed in the promise of America. And so that's why I'm so grateful to them for everything they've ever given to me. It's I always want to be worthy of their sacrifice.
Yeah, that's a neat story. Thank you for sharing it. I want to thank Ajit Pai for shooting straight with us, and I want to thank you for listening today. I hope this program has been informative, enlightening, and uniting. As Americans struggle with the difficult issues facing our country, we are reminded that good policy is the result of open, thoughtful discussion. God bless you, and remember to always shoot straight.